Welcome to this special edition of the Horror Library. Tonight, we'll explore three of Italy's darkest true crime cases, from one of the country's most infamous unsolved mysteries to the terrifying crimes of the Monster of Liguria, and finally, the shocking story of the Uno Bianca Gang. Sit back, relax, and let's begin. The Monster of Florence. Florence is a city built on beauty. For centuries, people have traveled there to walk beneath cathedral domes, cross medieval bridges, and stand in front of paintings that changed the course of Western art. Beyond the city, the landscape opens into the Tuscan countryside. Vineyards, stone farmhouses, narrow roads, and rolling hills disappearing toward the horizon. It is the kind of place sold on postcards. But beginning in the late 1960s, those hills acquired another reputation. After darkness fell, young couples would drive away from the crowded city in search of privacy. They parked on dirt roads, beside fields, in clearings hidden by trees. For most of them, the darkness meant privacy. For someone else, it meant opportunity. Over 17 years, 8 couples would be murdered in and around Florence. 16 people. Many were attacked while sitting inside parked cars. The same type of ammunition appeared again and again. In later attacks, the killer did something even more disturbing to some of the female victims. Police searched houses. Suspects were arrested. Trials were held. Men were convicted. And yet, decades later, one question remains remarkably difficult to answer. Who was the Monster of Florence? To understand why that question has survived for so long, we have to return to a warm summer night in 1968, and to a small boy walking alone through the darkness. Chapter 1. The Boy at the Door. August 21st, 1968. Near Signa, west of Florence, a car stood parked beside a cemetery. Inside were 32-year-old Barbara Locci and 29-year-old Antonio Lobianco. Barbara was married, but Antonio was not her husband. The relationship was part of a complicated network of affairs and personal rivalries that would later become extremely important to the investigation. But there was another person inside the car that night. Barbara's 6-year-old son, Natalino. He was sleeping in the back. At some point during the night, someone approached the vehicle. Then came the gunshots. Barbara and Antonio were shot at close range. 8 shots were reportedly fired. Somehow, Natalino survived. What happened immediately afterward became one of the most haunting scenes in the entire case. The young boy left the car and eventually arrived at a nearby house. It was late. A stranger opened the door and found a child standing outside. His mother was dead. The man she had been with was dead, and somewhere behind him, in the darkness, was whoever had killed him. Police began investigating. At the time, nobody spoke about a Monster of Florence. There was no serial killer investigation. There was simply a double murder involving a married woman and her lover. And investigators had an obvious suspect, Barbara's husband, Stefano Mele. Mele initially denied responsibility, changed his story repeatedly, implicated others, and ultimately confessed. He was convicted and sent to prison. As far as the authorities were concerned, the murder had been solved. And for several years, nothing happened that gave them reason to think otherwise. The gun disappeared. The killer disappeared. The case faded. Then 6 years later, another couple drove into the Tuscan countryside. Chapter 2. The Second Attack. September 14th, 1974. Pasquale Gentilcore and Stefania Pettini had gone to an isolated area near Borgo San Lorenzo. Like many young couples, they were looking for somewhere private. Late that night, someone approached them. The attacker opened fire. Both were shot. But this time, the violence did not stop when the victims died. Stefania's body was attacked with a knife. The brutality was shocking, yet there was no immediate reason for investigators to connect this crime with the murders from 1968. 6 years had passed. The victims were different. The location was different. The earlier crime supposedly already had a perpetrator behind bars. And so once again, the darkness returned to the hills around Florence. Years passed. 1975, 1976, 1977, 1978, 1979. No obvious continuation. Whatever had happened in 1974 appeared to be another isolated horror. Then came the summer of 1981, and the killings began again. Chapter 3, June 1981. June 6, 1981, Scandicci. 21-year-old Carmela DiNuccio and her boyfriend Giovanni Foggi had parked their Fiat Ritmo in an isolated area. It was Saturday night, the kind of warm Italian evening when young people stayed outside late. At some point, someone emerged from the darkness. Gunshots shattered the quiet. Giovanni was killed. Carmela was killed. But investigators quickly noticed something else. Carmela's body had been moved from the car. The killer had used a knife, and part of her body had been removed. Now the crime looked different. This did not feel like an argument that had escalated. It did not look like a robbery. There appeared to be ritual and repetition. The killer had approached a couple in a secluded location, attacked them with a firearm, and then focused additional violence on the woman. Investigators collected the cartridge cases. Ballistic experts examined them, and somewhere inside the evidence, a connection began to emerge. The ammunition was Winchester .22 caliber, marked with an H on the base. The weapon appeared to be a Beretta .22. Those details would become two of the most important clues in Italian criminal history, because the killer had used them before. The investigators just did not yet understand how far back the trail went. 4 months later, he struck again. Chapter 4, October. October 22nd, 1981, Calenzano. 24-year-old Stefano Baldi and 24-year-old Susanna Cambi were together in a Volkswagen Golf. They had plans. They had families. They had lives extending far beyond that night. But someone had followed, watched, or simply found them. Once again, the attack came in an isolated area. Once again, there were gunshots. And once again, the female victim was subjected to additional mutilation. By now, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Police were no longer dealing with unrelated crimes. Someone was hunting couples. The same gun appeared to be involved, the same ammunition, similar locations, similar victims, similar post-mortem behavior. Florence had a serial killer. Italian newspapers needed a name for him. Eventually, one name would eclipse all others. Il Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence. The name made him sound almost fictional. But there was nothing fictional about the bodies. And there was another terrifying problem. Police had almost nothing to work with. The killer operated at night. The locations were isolated. There were rarely useful witnesses. There was no obvious connection between the victims. He did not need to know them. He only needed to find them. And around Florence, there were countless secluded roads where young couples went to be alone. Every one of those places had suddenly become a potential crime scene. Chapter 5. The Weapon from the Past. Investigators began comparing evidence. The cartridge cases from the attacks told a story. The same firearm appeared to have been used across multiple murders. But when ballistic experts looked deeper into the history of the weapon, they found something extraordinary. The trail did not begin in 1974. It went back to 1968, back to Barbara Locci and Antonio Lobianco, back to the crime that supposedly had already been solved, back to Stefano Mele. There was an obvious problem. Mele had been imprisoned. If the same gun used in the 1968 murders was being fired again while he was incarcerated, then either he had not acted alone, someone else had possession of the weapon, or the original understanding of the crime was fundamentally wrong. Suddenly, an old murder case reopened a door investigators thought had been locked for more than a decade. And behind that door was a complicated world of jealousy, affairs, violence, and a group of Sardinian immigrants living in Tuscany. The investigation moved toward what became known as the Sardinian Trail. Barbara Locci had relationships with several men. Names were examined, alibis were checked, connections were mapped. Francesco Vinci became a major suspect. So did others associated with Barbara's social circle. The theory was tempting. Perhaps the weapon had passed from one person to another after the 1968 murders. Perhaps the monster was someone connected to that first crime. Perhaps solving 1968 would solve everything. Police made arrests. Interrogations followed. The press watched closely. And then the monster did something that repeatedly destroyed investigators' theories. He killed again. Chapter 6, 1982. June 19, 1982. Near Montespertoli, Paolo Minardi and Antonella Migliorini had parked in an isolated area. By now, stories about the monster had begun circulating widely. Couples knew there was danger. Some avoided the traditional lovers' lanes. Others took precautions. But fear competes poorly with normal life. Young people still wanted privacy. People still went out at night. And the monster only needed one opportunity. Shots were fired into Paolo and Antonella's car, but something went wrong. Paolo was still alive. Whether deliberately or in panic, the car moved and ended up in a ditch. The attack was interrupted. Both victims were eventually found alive. For investigators, this presented an extraordinary possibility. A survivor, someone who might finally describe the attacker. But their injuries were catastrophic. Antonella died shortly afterward. Paolo survived for several hours but was unable to provide police with the breakthrough they desperately needed. He died without identifying the killer. Another opportunity disappeared. Another couple was gone. And the monster returned to anonymity. The police continued focusing on suspects connected to the Sardinian Trail. But the investigation was about to become even more confusing because the next attack would happen while a major suspect was already behind bars. Chapter 7. The German Tourists. September 9th, 1983. Two German tourists, Wilhelm Friedrich Horst Meyer and Jens Uwe Rusch, were traveling through Italy. They stopped near Galuzzo and spent the night in a Volkswagen camper van. From outside, someone looking through the darkness may have believed the occupants were another heterosexual couple. One of the men reportedly had long hair. If the killer was specifically hunting men and women together, He may not have realized his mistake until the attack had already begun. Shots were fired. Both men were killed. There was no female victim. Therefore, there was no mutilation matching the previous attacks. But the firearm evidence linked the murders to the same series. For investigators, the implications were enormous. The monster was still active, and one of the people suspected of being him was in custody. Again, the killer seemed to be mocking the investigation without ever speaking directly to police. Arrest someone. The murders continue. Develop a theory. Another body destroys it. The case was becoming a maze. Every answer seemed to produce two new questions, and the public was becoming frightened. Chapter 8. Florence changes after dark. Serial murder does something unusual to a community. The statistical chance of becoming a victim may remain extremely small, but statistics mean very little when the method of selection appears random. The monster was not killing enemies. He was not targeting wealthy businessmen or members of a gang. He was targeting something much broader. Couples seeking privacy. That could be almost anyone. Young people began thinking differently about where they parked. Parents worried about their children. Newspapers published developments. Television discussed the case. Rumors multiplied. People claimed to have seen suspicious cars. Others reported strangers. Amateur investigators developed theories. And the hills that once offered privacy began to feel exposed. There was also something psychologically disturbing about the killer's method. He appeared to be watching. Before he could attack, he needed to know where couples went. He needed to approach without being noticed. That meant that somewhere beyond the headlights, perhaps behind vegetation or further down the road, someone could be observing. For couples sitting inside their cars, darkness no longer protected them from the outside world. It concealed the outside world from them. And in July 1984, another couple would learn that distinction too late. Chapter 9. Vicchio. July 29, 1984. Vicchio, northeast of Florence. Claudio Stefanacci and Pia Rontini were young. Pia was only 18. Claudio was 21. They parked in an isolated area. The pattern repeated. The gun, the shots, the knife, the mutilation. By this stage, investigators understood what they were seeing almost immediately. There was little doubt about who, or at least what, was responsible. The monster had returned, but knowing that did almost nothing to help catch him. Police had spent years investigating suspects. They had studied the first crime. They had pursued the Sardinian connection. They had arrested men. Still, the same weapon kept appearing. The killer seemed able to vanish into ordinary life. That possibility was frightening in its simplicity. The monster did not necessarily look unusual. He might have had a job, neighbors, a family. He might have bought groceries in Florence while newspapers carrying reports of his murders sat beside the register. He might have listened to strangers discussing the case. Perhaps he enjoyed it. Perhaps he feared being caught. Nobody knew. But what happened the following year suggested something important. The killer was not merely aware of the investigation. He may have wanted investigators to know that he was aware. Chapter 10. September 1985. Late summer 1985. Jean-Michel Cravechvili and Nadine Moreau had traveled from France. They were camping near San Cassiano in Val di Pesa, south of Florence. They were foreigners enjoying Tuscany. They could not have known that the area around them had become associated with one of Europe's most notorious unidentified killers. On the night of September 8th, someone approached their tent. Nadine was attacked first. Jean-Michel tried to escape. Imagine that moment. Dark countryside, a campsite, gunfire, then running. He made it out of the tent and attempted to flee, but the attacker pursued him. Jean-Michel was killed. Nadine was subjected to the mutilation that investigators had come to recognize. But this time, the killer did something different, something that transformed the crime from another attack into something resembling communication. Part of Nadine's breast was removed. Later, an envelope arrived at the prosecutor's office in Florence. Inside was tissue taken from her body. For years, police had been hunting a man they could not see. Now it appeared the monster had reached directly into their investigation. The message required no words. He knew they were looking for him, and he was still free. It was the 8th double murder attributed to the series. 16 victims, and then nothing. The killing stopped. Chapter 11. When a serial killer disappears. There is something uniquely frustrating about a killer who stops. When murders continue, investigators receive new evidence, new crime scenes, new witnesses, new mistakes. Every attack is a tragedy, but every attack can also contain the clue that finally ends the series. When the monster stopped killing after September 1985, the trail began to cool. There were theories. Perhaps he had died. Perhaps he had been imprisoned for another crime. Perhaps he had moved away. Perhaps age or illness had made continuing impossible. Or perhaps he had simply decided to stop. Police could not assume any of them were true. The weapon that connected the murders had never been recovered. The Beretta .22 became almost mythical. Somewhere, investigators believed there was a gun capable of unlocking the entire case. Whoever possessed it might possess the answer. Years passed. The investigation produced mountains of documents. Suspects came and went, and eventually attention began shifting toward a man whose background seemed almost designed for a true crime headline. His name was Pietro Pacciani. Chapter 12. Pietro Pacciani. Pacciani was a farmer from the Tuscan countryside. He was not an ordinary suspect with an ordinary past. In 1951, decades before the monster's most notorious crimes, Pacciani had killed a man after discovering him with a woman Pacciani was involved with. He had served prison time for that killing. Later, he was convicted of sexually abusing his daughters. By the time investigators focused heavily on him, he already had a history of violence that made him an easy man for the public to imagine as a monster. But being capable of terrible crimes does not prove someone committed a specific series of murders. Investigators needed evidence. They searched Pacciani's property. They examined his possessions. They investigated his movements. Among the evidence attracting attention was a spent cartridge found in his garden and other objects prosecutors attempted to connect to victims or crime scenes. The prosecution constructed a case. The theory was that Pacciani was the Monster of Florence. After years of uncertainty, Italy finally appeared to have a face to place behind the name. The case went to trial in 1994. The media attention was enormous. Pacciani denied being the monster. Prosecutors argued otherwise. Witnesses testified. Evidence accumulated, and the court reached a verdict: guilty. Pietro Pacciani was convicted in connection with multiple monster murders. For a moment, One of Italy's greatest criminal mysteries appeared to have been solved, but nothing about the Monster of Florence case remained simple for long. Chapter 13. The Monster is Acquitted. Pacciani appealed. In 1996, the appeals court overturned his conviction. He was acquitted. The supposed solution to the Monster of Florence case collapsed almost as dramatically as it had appeared, but prosecutors did not give up. Italy's highest court later ordered that Pacciani face another trial. The case was going back to court. Perhaps a new trial would finally establish whether the farmer really had been responsible. It never happened. On February 22, 1998, Pietro Pacciani was found dead at his home. He was 73 years old. The cause was reported as a heart attack. Pacciani died before the new trial could determine his fate. His first instance conviction, therefore, never became a final judicial resolution of the monster case. For some Italians, his death meant the monster had escaped justice. For others, an innocent or at least wrongly accused man had died under the weight of a national obsession. And the investigation was not finished because police had begun looking at people around Pacciani, men who would become known by an almost strangely casual phrase considering what they were accused of, the compagnie di merende, the snack companions. Chapter 14. The Snack Companions. The phrase referred principally to men in Pacciani's social circle, including Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti. Investigators began developing a new theory. Maybe the monster had never been one man. Maybe several people were involved. Giancarlo Lotti became particularly important. He eventually made statements implicating himself and others in several murders. According to the prosecution's theory, Pacciani, Vanni, and Lotti had participated in the killings together. This changed the entire image of the case. For years, the public had imagined a lone predator, one man hiding in the darkness, one man carrying the gun, one man selecting couples. Now prosecutors were presenting something else, a group. Lotti claimed to have been present during murders and described roles allegedly played by the others. The credibility of his testimony became a major point of controversy. Was he finally revealing the truth? Was he a vulnerable man telling investigators what they wanted to hear? Was part of his story true and part false? Those questions would haunt the case. Nevertheless, the judicial process moved forward. Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti were convicted in connection with several of the monster murders, with their sentences eventually becoming final. On paper, that sounds like an ending. Convictions, accomplices, a theory explaining multiple killers. But the Monster of Florence is remembered as an unresolved mystery for a reason. Even those convictions did not settle the larger question: who fired the gun in every attack? Who possessed it in 1968? How had the weapon moved through the years? Were the same people responsible for the entire series? And why were the mutilations performed? Those questions opened the door to an even darker theory. Chapter 15. The Masterminds. Investigators explored whether the men convicted or suspected were merely carrying out crimes for someone else. This became known broadly as the theory of the mandanti, the instigators or masterminds. According to versions of the theory, the female body parts removed during certain attacks may have been collected for another person or group. From there, the case entered territory involving alleged occult practices, wealthy clients, secret groups, and ritual motives. The theory was sensational. It was also deeply controversial. There has never been a definitive judicial finding establishing that a secret occult organization commissioned the monster murders. Yet the possibility became permanently attached to the case. And once a criminal investigation becomes surrounded by conspiracy theories, separating evidence from speculation becomes increasingly difficult. Every unexplained death becomes suspicious. Every powerful person becomes a possible participant. Every missing document becomes a cover-up. One name became particularly controversial: Francesco Narducci. Narducci was a doctor from Perugia who died in 1985, shortly after the monster's final known murders. His death was initially considered a drowning and later became the subject of intense speculation and further investigation. Theories attempted to connect him to the monster case and to alleged hidden networks behind the murders. But none produced the universally accepted solution investigators had spent decades seeking. Instead, the case grew larger. The monster was no longer merely a man with a gun in the Tuscan countryside. He had become a cultural phenomenon, a container for every unanswered question. Chapter 16. The People Who Watched the Watchers. There is another strange element to the story. By the 1980s, the lovers' lanes around Florence attracted more than couples. Voyeurs reportedly frequented some secluded areas. People watched from cars or from the darkness. Some engaged in blackmail or other criminal behavior. This created an investigative nightmare. Imagine trying to identify a suspicious person near a remote lover's lane when several people may already have been there specifically because they wanted to watch strangers without being seen. A witness might also be someone reluctant to admit why they were present. A suspicious vehicle might belong to the killer, or a voyeur, or another couple, or someone completely unrelated. The environment itself protected the monster. Privacy had created isolation. Isolation created vulnerability. And the social embarrassment associated with the locations potentially discouraged witnesses from coming forward. The killer had chosen an ecosystem where anonymity was unusually easy. And if he had spent time around those locations before attacking, he could have learned the roads, escape routes, and habits of the people who visited them. He did not need a supernatural intelligence. He needed patience. Chapter 17. The Gun. Through all the theories, suspects, and trials, one object remained constant: the gun, a .22 caliber Beretta. Combined with Winchester ammunition bearing the distinctive H marking, ballistic evidence linked the murders across the years. Think about the significance. People can lie, witnesses can misremember, confessions can be false, suspects can accuse one another. But the weapon leaves physical traces. That gun connected crimes separated by years. It connected the apparent domestic murder of 1968 to the serial attacks that followed. And yet the gun itself was never definitively recovered. Somewhere after the final murder, it disappeared. Maybe it was thrown into a river, buried, destroyed, hidden inside a wall, passed to another person, or perhaps it still exists, rusting in a forgotten box, its significance known only to whoever placed it there. If the weapon were ever recovered with a reliable chain of evidence, modern forensic analysis might answer questions investigators in the 1970s and 1980s could only dream of answering. But without it, the case remains anchored to cartridge cases and ballistic comparisons collected decades ago. The most important physical object in the story is also the object nobody can find. Chapter 18. 16 People The mythology surrounding the monster can sometimes overwhelm the people who actually died. So before going further, it is worth remembering what the number 16 represents. Barbara Locci and Antonio Lobianco, Pasquale Gentilcore and Stefania Pettini, Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Denuccio, Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi, Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini, Wilhelm Friedrich, Horst Meyer, and Jens-Uwe Rusch, Claudio Stefanacci and Pia Rontini, Jean-Michel Cravechvili and Nadine Morio. 8 couples, 16 separate lives. They came from Italy, Germany, and France. Some were barely adults, some were traveling, some were simply spending an evening with someone they loved. They could not have known that decades later, strangers would study photographs of the places where they died and debate theories about the person responsible. The killer became famous. The victims became part of his nickname. That is one of the uncomfortable realities of true crime. The offender becomes the recurring character, but the victims paid the price. Chapter 19. The Case That Refused to Die. The murders ended in 1985, but the Monster of Florence never really disappeared. Books were written, documentaries were made, investigators continued examining leads, journalists returned to the evidence, amateur detectives constructed enormous timelines. New suspects emerged. Old suspects were reconsidered. Families demanded answers. Decades after the final attack, relatives of victims were still asking investigators to reconsider evidence and theories surrounding the case. Interest continued returning whenever new documentaries, books, or investigative developments appeared. Nearly 6 decades after the first murders, people are still looking for the answer. That longevity tells us something. Most criminal cases become simpler with time. The evidence is organized. A verdict becomes accepted. The public moves on. The Monster of Florence did the opposite. Every decade seemed to add another layer. The Sardinian Trail, Pacciani, the snack companions, the alleged masterminds, the occult theories, Narducci, new forensic claims, new suspects, new challenges to old evidence. Instead of narrowing toward one answer, the case expanded outward. Chapter 20. Was there really one monster? This may be the most important question. When we say the Monster of Florence, the phrase creates an image. One killer, one personality, one motive. But what if that assumption is wrong? The ballistic evidence strongly links the same firearm to the murder series. That does not automatically prove the same person pulled the trigger every time. A weapon can change hands. Multiple people can participate in crimes. One offender can inspire another. Accomplices can enter or leave a series. And the 17-year span makes those possibilities particularly important. Consider the timeline. 1968, then 6 years. 1974, then another long gap. Then 1981. After that, the attacks become more frequent. Why? Did the same person simply remain dormant? Was the gun inaccessible? Did circumstances change? Was the 1968 killing fundamentally different? With the gun later falling into the hands of someone who became the monster? Or was 1968 always the beginning? Investigators have wrestled with these possibilities for decades, and each theory solves certain problems while creating others. The Sardinian Trail helps explain the origin of the gun. Pacciani's background makes him a plausible violent offender, but does not erase controversy surrounding the evidence against him. The snack companion theory accounts for multiple participants, but depends heavily on testimony whose reliability has been debated. The mastermind theories attempt to explain the mutilations, but introduce claims that have never been definitively proven. There is no clean answer. And that may be why the case remains so compelling, not because there is no evidence, but because there is so much evidence pointing in so many directions. Chapter 21. The Monster and the Media. By the height of the killings, the monster had become part of Italian popular consciousness. That creates another problem in serial murder investigations. Publicity can help. It generates tips. It warns potential victims. It places pressure on institutions. But publicity can also contaminate. People begin remembering things they may never have seen. False confessors emerge. Witnesses become influenced by newspaper reports. Suspects understand what police know, and killers can become aware of the mythology forming around them. In the monster's case, the 1985 mailing to the prosecutor was particularly chilling because it suggested a willingness to communicate through the crime itself. The killer did not need to write a manifesto. The contents of the envelope were enough. It said, in effect, "You are looking for me, I know, and you still cannot stop me." Then the murders ended. That silence may have been the monster's final message. Chapter 22. If he survived. Suppose for a moment that none of the men publicly associated with the case was the sole monster. Suppose the person responsible for firing the gun in the murders survived beyond 1985. What happened to him? If he was 25 years old in 1968, he would be over 80 today. If he was 35, he would be in his 90s. It is entirely possible that the person who knew the full truth has already died. Perhaps he died without confessing. Perhaps relatives discovered something after his death and never understood its importance. Perhaps somebody knows more than they have said. Cold cases often end this way, not with a dramatic arrest, but with time slowly removing everyone capable of answering the question. Yet technology has changed. DNA analysis has solved crimes once considered impossible. Old fingerprints can be re-examined, documents can be digitized and compared, geographic profiling can reveal patterns invisible to earlier investigators. That creates the smallest possibility that the Monster of Florence could still receive an ending. Not because the killer makes a mistake tomorrow, but because investigators discover a mistake he made 40 years ago. Chapter 23. The Last Drive. Imagine Florence in September 1985. The newspapers are filled with fear. Police know the monster has killed again. Somewhere in an evidence room are cartridge cases from years of murders. Somewhere, investigators are staring at maps, roads, fields, forests, dots representing places where people died, and somewhere else, perhaps only a few kilometers away, someone is going home. Maybe he washes his hands. Maybe he hides the gun. Maybe he burns clothing. Maybe he sits down at a table. Maybe nobody around him notices anything unusual. He does not know that the murders will still be discussed 40 years later. He does not know that investigators who have not even begun their careers will eventually study his crimes. He does not know that books will be written about him. That television series will recreate the roads he traveled. That strangers across the world will learn a nickname he never chose for himself, the Monster of Florence. And then, for reasons still unknown, he never kills again. Final chapter, The Shadow over Tuscany. Today, Tuscany is still Tuscany. The vineyards remain. The roads wind through the hills. Florence continues attracting millions of visitors drawn by art, architecture, and history. Most people walking through the city will never see any trace of what happened outside it decades ago. There is no monster waiting behind every tree. There never was. There was a person, or perhaps several people. And that is ultimately what makes the story more disturbing than the nickname. Monsters belong in mythology. They are creatures we invent because evil is easier to understand when it looks different from us. But whoever committed these murders drove on ordinary roads, used an ordinary weapon, watched ordinary people, and returned somehow to ordinary life. 16 people died between 1968 and 1985 in a series of double murders linked by the same gun. Men were investigated, men were arrested, men were convicted. One of the most famous suspects was convicted, acquitted, and died before he could be tried again. Thousands of pages were written, decades of police work followed, and still, no single explanation has managed to close every door. Perhaps Pietro Pacciani was involved. Perhaps Vanni and Lottie knew more than they initially admitted. Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in the Sardinian Trail. Perhaps investigators once interviewed the real killer and let him walk away. Or perhaps the truth is something nobody has yet imagined. We may never know. Somewhere in the history of Florence, however, there is an answer. Someone owned the gun. Someone bought the ammunition. Someone knew the roads. Someone watched the couples. Someone pulled the trigger. And for 17 years, while one of the most beautiful cities in Europe slept nearby, someone walked through the darkness of the Tuscan hills. His face remains uncertain. His motive remains debated. His weapon has never been definitively found. But the name Italy gave him has survived. Il Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence. And almost 60 years after the first murders, the monster still has no universally accepted face. End. While the investigation into the Monster of Florence slowly came to an end, another killer was preparing to spread fear across northern Italy. This time, investigators weren't searching for an unknown monster, but for a man who would become one of Italy's deadliest serial killers. Donato Bilancia, the Monster of Liguria, the gambler who became one of Italy's deadliest serial killers. April 1998. Somewhere between Genoa and the towns scattered along the Ligurian coast, a train moved through the darkness. Inside, passengers sat beneath fluorescent lights as stations appeared and disappeared beyond the windows. Some read newspapers, some slept. Others simply waited for their stop. Among them was a man in his late 40s. He did not look particularly dangerous. He was well-dressed, accustomed to expensive cars, restaurants, casinos, and the nightlife of northern Italy. His name was Donato Bilancia, and by this point, he had already killed more people than almost anyone around him could have imagined. For months, bodies had been appearing across Liguria: a gambler, his wife, jewelers, security guards, sex workers, people killed inside homes, businesses, cars, and lonely stretches of road. At first, the crimes seemed disconnected. Different victims, different locations, different apparent motives. Some looked like robberies. Others appeared personal. But now, the killer was changing. Money was becoming irrelevant. Revenge was becoming irrelevant. Bilancia had reached the point where a stranger sitting alone on a train could become his next victim for no reason beyond being there. Soon, Italy would know his name. But before police could understand why 17 people had died, they first had to understand the man responsible, a thief a gambler, a loner, a man obsessed with humiliation and betrayal, and eventually a killer who discovered something terrifying about himself. Once he had crossed the line into murder, crossing it again became easier. Chapter 1. The Boy from Potenza. Donato Bilancia was born in Potenza, southern Italy in 1951. His childhood did not remain there for long. His family moved north to Genoa while he was still young, joining the enormous movement of Italians who left poorer southern regions for the industrial cities of the north during the post-war years. Genoa should have offered opportunity. For Bilancia, it became the city around which most of his life would revolve. By his own later description, home was not a peaceful place. He spoke of arguments, violence, and an unhappy family environment. School offered little escape. He struggled academically and eventually abandoned his education. What interested him more was the world outside respectable society. Bars, streets, cars, gambling, crime. He worked legitimate jobs at different times, including as a bartender, baker, and mechanic. But ordinary employment never provided the lifestyle he wanted. Theft did. Bilancia discovered that he had a talent for burglary. He learned locks, he learned apartments, he learned how to enter places without being noticed, and equally importantly, how to leave them. Prison sentences followed, and prison introduced him to more experienced criminals. Instead of removing him from crime, incarceration became another part of his education. By adulthood, Bilancia was not known as a murderer. He was known as a professional criminal, a thief, someone who understood the underworld but generally lived within its unwritten rules. For years, that distinction held. He stole, he gambled, he went to prison, he came out, he returned to crime. There was nothing yet suggesting that at the age of 46, he would suddenly begin killing people at an extraordinary rate. But beneath the surface, Bilancia was becoming increasingly isolated, and one of the things he hated most was humiliation. Chapter 2. The Gambler. Gambling became central to Bilancia's identity. He frequented illegal gambling rooms and the casino of San Remo. Poker, dice, roulette. The game mattered, but so did the image surrounding it. Bilancia wanted people to see success. He dressed well. He drove expensive cars, including Mercedes. He paid for dinners. He bought drinks. When he had money, he displayed it. Crime allowed him to live above the level his legitimate employment could have supported. But gambling has a way of turning wealth into debt with astonishing speed. Bilancia could win heavily and lose heavily. When he lost, he returned to theft and other crimes to rebuild what he had spent. There was also something deeper happening. Gambling offered him an environment where reputation mattered. Who was clever? Who could read the room? Who could not be fooled? Bilancia liked to see himself as someone difficult to deceive. He had survived prisons and criminal circles. He believed he understood people, and that made what happened in 1997 especially dangerous. Bilancia trusted a man connected to his gambling world. That trust led him into games where he lost an enormous amount of money, reportedly hundreds of millions of Italian lire. Losing the money hurt. But Bilancia came to believe something worse had happened. The games had been manipulated. He had not simply lost. He had been played. According to later accounts, Bilancia overheard men discussing how they had brought him in as the fool who could be exploited. For someone obsessed with pride, that distinction mattered enormously. He had spent years believing he was the person who outsmarted everyone else. Now, he believed people he trusted had laughed at him behind his back. Bilancia would later describe the anger that followed. Two men, he decided, had humiliated him. And in his mind, humiliation required revenge. If you've made it this far, I would really appreciate if you subscribe. Thank you, and enjoy. Chapter 3, October 15th, 1997. The first killing came on October 15th, 1997. Bilancia targeted Giorgio Centenaro, a man connected to the gambling world in which Bilancia believed he had been cheated. This murder was different from many that would follow because it was deeply personal. Bilancia went to Centenaro's home. He was not searching for a random victim. He knew why he was there. According to Bilancia's later confession, he wanted Centenaro to understand why he was dying. The killing was prolonged. Bilancia restrained him and suffocated him. There was no dramatic shootout, no chaotic robbery. This was punishment. In Bilancia's mind, he was settling a debt that had nothing to do with the amount of money he had lost. It was about disrespect. When he left, something fundamental had changed. Donato Bilancia had been a criminal for decades. He had stolen cars, burglarized properties, spent time around people who lived outside the law. But murder had represented another boundary. On October 15th, he crossed it. And once that boundary disappeared, the next murder came only days later. Chapter 4, The Friend Who Betrayed Him. 9 days after the first killing, Bilancia turned toward another man he blamed for the gambling betrayal, Maurizio Parenti. If Centenaro represented the game itself, Parenti represented something more personal. Bilancia had considered him a friend. Now he believed that friend had deliberately delivered him into a trap. Bilancia went to the home where Parenti lived with his wife. This time, he brought a gun. The confrontation ended quickly. Maurizio was shot. His wife, Carla, was also killed. In a matter of minutes, Bilancia's victim count had risen from 1 to 3. Carla's death also revealed something disturbing. The logic of revenge was already expanding. Whatever grievance Bilancia believed he had against Maurizio, Carla was not responsible for cheating him at cards. She died because she was there. That shift would become increasingly important. At first, Bilancia could explain his murders to himself as revenge. People had betrayed him. People had humiliated him. People deserved punishment. But murder was beginning to detach itself from that justification. Soon, he would kill for money, then convenience, then anger, and eventually, seemingly, because he wanted to. The transformation did not take years. It took weeks. Chapter 5, When Revenge Became Opportunity. Once Bilancia had killed 3 people, his behavior changed rapidly. The next victims were not necessarily people connected to his humiliation. He began using murder as part of other crimes. Genoa and the surrounding Ligurian region offered him familiar territory. He knew the roads. He knew the nightlife. He understood businesses and closing hours. He understood how criminals thought because he had been one for most of his adult life. Among his next victims were jewelers. Robbery provided an obvious motive. Jewelry could be sold. Money could finance gambling and his lifestyle. But Bilancia was no longer simply a burglar who wanted to avoid confrontation. Now, eliminating witnesses had become an option. He could enter a business, take what he wanted, and leave bodies behind. For investigators, this created a major problem. A murder committed during a jewelry robbery does not automatically look connected to the suffocation of a gambler. Different method, different motive, different victim profile. The crimes seem to belong to different worlds. Bilancia benefited from that confusion. Police departments could investigate individual murders without realizing that the same man was moving between them. He was not following the kind of rigid pattern people often associate with serial killers. He did not have one specific type of victim. He had something more dangerous, a willingness to kill whenever murder suited whatever need he felt in that moment. Chapter 6. A killer without a pattern. Serial killers are often described through patterns. A particular age group, a particular appearance, a particular method, a particular ritual. Those patterns can help investigators connect crimes. Bilancia was difficult precisely because his crimes could appear so different. Men and women, people he knew and people he had never met. Victims killed for revenge and victims killed for money. People inside homes, people at work, people on roads. Later, people aboard trains. The apparent randomness acted almost like camouflage. Imagine an investigator examining one murder. A jeweler killed during a robbery suggests a robber. A security guard killed at night suggests a confrontation. A sex worker killed inside a car suggests a sexually motivated offender. A gambler murdered in his home suggests a personal dispute. Each explanation makes sense individually. Only when the cases are placed beside one another does another possibility appear. What if the motive is changing because the killer is the constant? By late 1997 and early 1998, Bilancia was moving through Liguria carrying a Smith & Wesson .38 special revolver. The gun would eventually help connect the trail he was leaving behind. But before investigators understood that trail, more people would die. Chapter 7. The Night Watchman. Security guards and night watchmen occupy a strange position in cities after dark. Their job is to remain awake while everyone else sleeps. They drive through industrial areas, check businesses, and respond when something looks wrong. For a criminal like Bilancia, they represented an obstacle. During his killing spree, a night watchman became another victim. Again, the murder could be interpreted through a conventional criminal motive. Bilancia was a burglar. A security guard could recognize him, interrupt him, or become a witness. Killing the guard removed the problem. But by now, the speed of the murders was becoming extraordinary. Bilancia had spent decades committing crimes without becoming a serial murderer. Now, in his mid-40s, he seemed unable or unwilling to stop escalating. The intervals between deaths shortened. The reasons became weaker. It was as if the first murders had opened a door that Bilancia no longer cared to close. Later, one investigator would summarize the transformation with a frighteningly simple idea. Bilancia had discovered how easy killing could be. Not morally easy, mechanically easy. A gun, a vulnerable person, a few seconds, then silence. Once murder became just another tool, almost any encounter could become fatal. Chapter 8. The Coast. Liguria is one of Italy's most recognizable regions. Mountains descend toward the Mediterranean. Towns sit along narrow stretches of coast. Genoa dominates the center, while roads and railway lines follow the sea toward France in the west and Tuscany in the east. Tourists know the region for beaches, colorful buildings, and summer holidays. Bilancia knew another Liguria. Nightclubs, gambling rooms, prostitutes working along roads, petrol stations open late, security guards traveling alone, the spaces people pass through without thinking about them, During the winter and spring of 1998, those spaces became hunting grounds. Bilancia began targeting sex workers. The killings occurred in different coastal locations, including areas around Genoa and towns such as Cogoleto, Arenzano, and Varazze. The women entered his car expecting a customer. Instead, they encountered a man whose motives had become increasingly difficult to define. He robbed some victims. In other cases, the financial gain was negligible compared with the violence. Several women were killed, and because sex workers often meet strangers in isolated places, the killer, again, benefited from an environment with few witnesses. A dark road, a parked car, someone hears a noise and assumes it is nothing. By morning, Bilancia is miles away. Chapter 9. The Man in the Mercedes. Bilancia's taste for expensive cars would eventually contribute to his downfall. He liked Mercedes vehicles. They suited the image he cultivated: successful, controlled, sophisticated. To a stranger, the man behind the wheel might look like a businessman rather than a career burglar. That appearance could lower suspicion. But cars create records: registration documents, sales, traffic fines, witness descriptions, places and times. Bilancia traveled constantly during the murders, moving between Genoa and towns scattered across Liguria and beyond. Each journey created another invisible thread connecting him to the crime scenes. At first, nobody knew to look for those threads. Then investigators began collecting them: a particular car seen in one area, a description from another. Traffic violations recorded around locations that would later become important. Bilancia believed movement protected him. In reality, movement was creating a map. Police simply had not yet learned whose map it was. Chapter 10. March 24, 1998. Novi Ligure, March 24, 1998. Bilancia was parked in the grounds of a private villa with Lorena, a transgender sex worker. Two security guards approached the vehicle. Perhaps to Bilancia, their arrival represented everything he hated: interference, authority, the possibility of being questioned or identified. The guards got out. Bilancia reacted with overwhelming violence. He shot both men, killing them. Lorena understood immediately that she was in mortal danger. She tried to escape. Bilancia pursued her. He caught up with her and shot her multiple times. Then he left. He believed she was dead. He was wrong. Lorena survived. After months of murders with few useful witnesses, Donato Bilancia had finally left someone alive who had seen him. She remembered details: his appearance, his clothing, his eyes, his voice, and crucially, the black Mercedes associated with him. Investigators now had something they had lacked throughout much of the spree: a living person who could describe the killer. Bilancia did not know it yet, but the countdown to his arrest had begun. The problem was that the countdown would last long enough for him to kill again. Chapter 11. The Survivor. A survivor can transform an investigation. Physical evidence tells police what happened. A survivor can sometimes tell them who did it. Lorena's account allowed investigators to construct a clearer description of the man they were looking for. Police could compare her information with other cases. They could look again at vehicles, at locations, at the seemingly disconnected murders spread across Liguria. Gradually, the possibility of one offender became harder to ignore. Ballistics were crucial. The same Smith & Wesson .38 special was linked to multiple killings. Suddenly, crimes that had looked separate began moving toward one another. the jewelers, the sex workers, the security guards, the killings along the coast. One weapon created a bridge between victims who otherwise had almost nothing in common. Somewhere in northern Italy was a man who had killed again and again, changing his motive as easily as he changed locations. Police were getting closer, but Balancia was about to make a decision that would change the psychological character of the entire series. He would leave the roads and cars behind. He would board a train. Chapter 12. The Woman on the Train. April 1998. Passenger trains traveled along the Ligurian coast every day, carrying commuters, students, tourists, and families. A train feels public. Even when a carriage is quiet, other people are usually only a few meters away. Stations appear regularly. Conductors move through the coaches, doors open, passengers enter and leave. It does not feel like the kind of place where a serial killer can operate unnoticed. Balancia saw it differently. He selected a woman traveling alone. There was no gambling debt between them, no robbery requiring a witness to be eliminated, no personal betrayal. She was a stranger. Balancia followed her toward the toilet area of the train. There, in a confined space, while the carriage continued moving through Italy, he killed her. The attack sent a new kind of fear through the country. Until then, people might have reassured themselves that the killer belonged to a specific world. Criminals, gambling rooms, sex work, night roads. But a woman on a train belonged to everyone's world. If the victim could be a random passenger, then the killer's boundaries had disappeared. Chapter 13. Another train? Then Balancia did it again. Another woman, another train, another seemingly random selection. This time, any remaining illusion of a limited motive collapsed. Italy now faced the possibility that someone was boarding public trains and choosing women to murder. Media attention intensified. The story spread beyond Liguria. Passengers became nervous. Women traveling alone had reason to look differently at the men entering their carriage. Police were under enormous pressure. The killings had moved from the margins of society into one of the country's most ordinary public spaces. The railway connected cities across Italy. Millions used it. The idea that a killer could sit quietly among them before selecting a stranger was terrifying. And yet, from Balancia's perspective, the attacks revealed how confident he had become. Months earlier, his first murder had required a grievance. Now he needed almost nothing: a victim, an opportunity, a place where he believed he could escape. That was enough. Chapter 14. 17. Between October 15th, 1997 and April 20th, 1998, 17 people were killed by Donato Balancia. 9 men, 8 women, 17 lives in roughly 6 months. The number is difficult to process because the timeline is so compressed. This was not a killer operating once every few years. At the height of the spree, deaths followed one another rapidly. Investigators later had to reconstruct a sequence that moved across motives and locations: revenge, robbery, witness elimination, violence against sex workers, security guards, random women on trains. Balancia's behavior resisted a simple explanation because he was not killing for one reason. Instead, murder had become integrated into the way he responded to the world. If someone betrayed him, he could kill. If someone had money, he could kill. If someone interrupted him, he could kill. If a stranger attracted his attention, he could kill. That absence of a stable victim profile made him extraordinarily dangerous. There was no single group that could be warned to avoid him. By the final weeks, almost anyone unfortunate enough to enter the wrong space at the wrong time could potentially become part of his sequence. Chapter 15. The Investigation Tightens. The Carabinieri in Genoa and prosecutors began bringing the pieces together. Ballistic evidence linked shootings. Lorina's survival provided a description. Then came another important lead, the Mercedes. A man involved in selling Bilancia of Mercedes reportedly came forward because traffic fines connected with the vehicle continued arriving. Those fines turned out to be extraordinarily useful. There were dozens of them. Locations and dates began overlapping with areas where murders had occurred. Cogoleto, Arenzano, Ventimiglia. Places already appearing in investigators' files now appeared in the movement history associated with the car. The owner had a name, Donato Bilancia. Police checked him. What they found was strange. Bilancia was absolutely a criminal. He had a long history of burglary, theft, and gambling, but nothing in his known record suggested 17 murders. To investigators, he looked like a member of the ordinary criminal world, not a serial killer. Yet his photograph resembled the description provided by Lorina. His movements fit. His car fit. His background placed him around some of the worlds connected to the victims. Police began watching him. Chapter 16. The man who didn't know he was being hunted. Surveillance creates an unusual moment in a murder investigation. Police may believe they are watching a serial killer while the suspect continues living as though nothing has changed. Bilancia went to bars, drove his car, smoked cigarettes, drank coffee. Investigators followed. They needed evidence strong enough to transform suspicion into certainty, and Bilancia unknowingly began providing it. Police obtained biological material from items he discarded, including a cigarette butt and a cup used for coffee. Modern forensic techniques allowed investigators to compare his DNA with evidence relevant to the crimes. The net tightened. Bilancia had spent months controlling encounters. He chose when to approach. He chose when to draw the gun. He chose when to leave. Now, other people were controlling the situation around him, watching his movements, collecting what he threw away, building a case without his knowledge. The professional burglar who had spent his life avoiding police surveillance had become the most closely watched man in the investigation. Chapter 17. May 6th. May 6th, 1998. Around 11 in the morning, police arrested Donato Bilancia. There was no dramatic gunfight, no final chase along the coast, no hostage situation. The man responsible for one of the fastest killing sprees in modern Italian history was simply taken into custody. Initially, investigators accused him of a smaller number of murders than the 17 ultimately attributed to him. Bilancia denied responsibility. For approximately a week, he maintained that position. Police had evidence. They had the car, they had witness information, they had ballistic connections, they had DNA. But they did not yet have the full story. Then Bilancia changed. He asked to speak. According to accounts of the interrogation, he told investigators that only he knew everything he had done because he had acted alone. And then he corrected them. They were not dealing with 8 murders. There were 17. He would tell them about all of them. Chapter 18. The Confession. Confessions from serial killers can be strange documents. Sometimes they are full of excuses. Sometimes offenders exaggerate. Sometimes they minimize. Sometimes they treat murder with a casualness that seems impossible to reconcile with what they are describing. Bilancia began reconstructing his 6-month spree. He explained the gambling betrayal, the anger, the first murder, the revenge against the friend he believed had betrayed him. Then the other killings. Investigators listened as separate case files suddenly became chapters in one man's story. The robberies, the guards, the women, the trains. Bilancia referred to the sequence in almost analytical terms. What had seemed chaotic from outside had its own chronology inside his mind, but there was no single explanation capable of making 17 murders rational. The first killings had grievances behind them. Later, killings did not. Something had changed after the first murders. Bilancia himself struggled to fully explain it. The question investigators and psychiatrists faced was obvious. Had he become mentally incapable of understanding what he was doing? Or had he understood perfectly and simply stopped caring? Chapter 19. Inside the mind of Donato Bilancia. Psychiatric examinations became crucial. Italian courts needed to determine whether Bilancia was criminally responsible for his actions. A person can be psychologically disturbed without being legally insane. That distinction mattered. Experts examined his personality, history, and behavior. They found a deeply troubled man, but not one who had lost contact with reality to the point that he could not understand his actions. Bilancia planned crimes. He concealed evidence. He selected opportunities. He escaped. He changed methods depending on circumstances. Those behaviors suggested awareness. He knew police existed. He knew murder was illegal. He knew capture would mean prison. He acted to avoid that outcome. His personality showed profound dysfunction, but the courts ultimately treated him as responsible. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect was the apparent lack of normal remorse. Bilancia could describe deaths while focusing heavily on his own grievances. He saw himself not only as an offender, but repeatedly as a victim of his family, of betrayal, of humiliation, of life itself. In that worldview, his suffering occupied the center. The suffering he created belonged to everyone else. Chapter 20. The Brother and the Train. One event from Bilancia's earlier life has often been discussed when examining his psychological history. In 1987, his brother Michel died by suicide by throwing himself in front of a train. Tragically, Michel took his young son with him. The child was Bilancia's nephew, whom he reportedly loved deeply. The deaths devastated the family. Years later, Bilancia would murder women aboard trains. It is tempting to draw a straight psychological line between these events. A traumatic death involving a train, followed years later by murders on trains. But true crime often becomes misleading when every detail is forced into symbolism. There is no simple equation proving that one caused the other. Human behavior is more complicated. What can be said is that Bilancia accumulated resentment and loss across his life. Family conflict, prison, isolation, gambling, betrayal, his brother and nephew's deaths. None of these events made murder inevitable. Millions of people experience grief, humiliation, and trauma without harming anyone. The responsibility remained Bilancia's. But investigators wanted to understand why a career criminal who had reached his mid-40s without becoming a serial killer suddenly killed 17 people in half a year. His past offered pieces. It never provided one complete answer. Chapter 21. The Trial. The evidence against Bilancia was overwhelming, particularly after his confession. The trial was not about identifying a mysterious unknown offender in the way the Monster of Florence case had been. Italy knew who had killed these people. The court's task was to determine responsibility and punishment. Bilancia faced charges for 17 murders as well as other crimes committed during the spree. He was convicted and received multiple life sentences, 13 life terms, along with additional punishment for the crimes surrounding the murders. Ray News: there would be no return to the casinos, no more Mercedes on the Ligurian coast, no more nights in illegal gambling rooms. The man who had spent much of his adult life moving in and out of prison was now entering prison with effectively no expectation of returning to ordinary life. But a conviction cannot reverse a killing spree. 17 families were left with an absence that no sentence could repair. Chapter 22. The Victims Behind the Number. Yes, 17 is an easy number to repeat. It fits into headlines. 17 victims, one of Italy's deadliest serial killers. But 17 is not one event. It is 17 endings. Giorgio Centenato, Maurizio Parenti, and his wife Carla, business owners who expected to return home after work. Security guards who believed they were carrying out another routine night shift. Women working along the Ligurian coast. People whose names became attached to an investigation they never chose to enter. And 2 women who boarded trains expecting nothing more unusual than arriving at their destinations. Bilancia's victims did not form one neat category because they were never supposed to. They were separate people living separate lives. The only thing eventually connecting them was him. This is part of what makes Bilancia's case so unsettling. With some serial offenders, investigators can identify an obsession that determines who is targeted. Bilancia's violence became broader. Revenge might explain one murder, robbery might explain another, but by the end, those explanations had almost disappeared. The victims increasingly died because Bilancia had reached a point where another person's life carried almost no weight against whatever impulse he felt at that moment. Chapter 23, 22 Years Behind Bars. Bilancia remained imprisoned for more than 2 decades. The outside world changed enormously. Italy entered a new century. The lira disappeared and the euro arrived. Mobile phones became smartphones. The internet transformed how crime stories were reported and remembered. Bilancia remained behind walls. His name periodically returned to newspapers and documentaries. Psychologists and journalists continued asking the same question. What happened during those 6 months? How did a man who had lived as a thief and gambler for decades suddenly become one of Italy's most prolific serial killers? Bilancia sometimes gave interviews and statements, but no explanation completely solved the contradiction. Perhaps there was no single moment beyond the first murder. Perhaps that was the transformation. Before October 15, 1997, murder was something Bilancia had not done. After October 15th, it was something he knew he could do. Once that internal barrier disappeared, every new grievance or opportunity entered a different calculation. Chapter 24, December 2020. In 2020, prisons across Europe faced a threat nobody had anticipated when Bilancia was sentenced. COVID-19 spread rapidly through communities, hospitals, and detention facilities. Bilancia was imprisoned in Padua. By then, he was 69 years old. In December, he contracted the virus. On December 17, 2020, Donato Bilancia died after more than 22 years in custody. Ray News. There was no dramatic final confession, because there was no central mystery of identity left to solve. Bilancia had already admitted the murders. The gunman had been found. The sequence had been reconstructed. The court had passed judgment. But one mystery followed him to the end. Why did it happen when it did? Why 1997? Why, after decades as a criminal, did killing suddenly become routine? The gambling betrayal provides the ignition. It does not completely explain the fire that followed. Chapter 25. 6 months. The timeline remains perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the case. October 15, 1997, the first murder. April the 20th, 1998, the final killing in the series, roughly half a year, 17 victims. Think about how short 6 months actually is. Autumn becomes winter. Christmas passes. New Year arrives. Winter becomes spring. For most people, half a year can disappear without anything particularly memorable happening. During that same length of time, Bilancia moved from killing a man out of revenge to murdering strangers aboard public trains. The acceleration is frightening. There was no decade-long evolution, no long cooling-off periods. He crossed the threshold and kept moving. Revenge became robbery. Robbery became convenience. Convenience became predation. By the time investigators identified him, the original gambling dispute almost seemed to belong to another story entirely. Chapter 26. 2 Italian Monsters. The contrast with another Italian case is striking. The Monster of Florence terrified Tuscany across 17 years. Investigators chased suspects, theories, and a missing gun. Even decades later, the identity and structure behind the murders remained disputed. Donato Bilancia was almost the opposite. His spree lasted months. Police identified him. Physical evidence connected him to the crimes. He confessed. He was convicted. We know his name. We know his face. We know where he went. We know much of what he did. And yet, certainty about identity did not produce certainty about motive. The Monster of Florence leaves us asking, who? Donato Bilancia leaves us asking, why? Perhaps the second question is sometimes harder. Chapter 27. The Ordinary Criminal. One of the investigators involved in the case later recalled the surprise of discovering who Bilancia really was. To law enforcement, he had been a thief and gambler, someone from the ordinary criminal underworld. That description is important. Bilancia did not spend his entire life publicly behaving like a serial killer waiting to emerge. He had a criminal record, certainly. He had spent time in prison. He was not an innocent man suddenly transformed overnight, but there is still an enormous distance between burglary and 17 murders. Police knew criminals like Bilancia, men who stole, gambled, fought, went to prison, came out, returned to the same circles. Most never became serial murderers. Bilancia crossed that distance at 46. Perhaps that is why the case remains disturbing, even though it is solved. We prefer warning signs to be obvious. We prefer monsters to announce themselves early. Bilancia did not. For decades, he was dangerous in familiar ways. Then suddenly, he became dangerous in a way almost nobody anticipated. Chapter 28. The Last Passenger. There is one image that captures the final stage of Bilancia's transformation better than almost anything else. A train carriage, a woman traveling alone, a man she does not know sitting somewhere nearby. She has no gambling connection to him. She has not betrayed him. She does not possess jewelry he desperately needs. She has never insulted him. Their lives have simply intersected for a few minutes because both bought passage on the same railway. That is all. Earlier in the spree, Bilancia told himself stories about why people had to die. By the end, the story barely mattered. The victim did not need to have done anything. Bilancia had become the reason. Final chapter: The Monster of Liguria. Today, people travel the Ligurian Railway without thinking about Donato Bilancia. Trains move between Genoa and coastal towns. Tourists look through the windows toward the Mediterranean. Cars pass through Arenzano, Cogoleto, and Ventimiglia. Genoa's bars fill at night. The places survived. Cities always do. What remains is the memory of 6 months when seemingly unrelated murders began appearing across the region. At first, nobody could see the shape of what was happening. A gambler died. Then another man and his wife. Jewelers were killed. A night watchman. Sex workers. Security guards. Women aboard trains. Each crime appeared to have its own explanation until investigators realized that the explanation was driving between all of them in a Mercedes. Donato Bilancia was eventually caught because the chaos he created was not as random as it appeared. A survivor remembered him. A gun connected crimes. A car created a trail. Traffic fines placed him near important locations. DNA strengthened the case. Investigators watched him, waited, and finally closed the net. When they arrested him, they believed they were confronting the man responsible for several murders. Bilancia told them the truth was worse. 17. He had killed 17 people. His first murders had been born from revenge after a gambling betrayal. But revenge alone cannot explain what came next. Somewhere during those 6 months, killing stopped being a response to one specific grievance and became part of the way Bilancia moved through the world. A person could die because they had betrayed him, because they interrupted him, because they possessed something he wanted, because they entered his car, or eventually because they happened to be sitting on the same train. Bilancia spent the next 22 years in prison. He died in 2020, taking whatever final explanation existed inside his mind with him. But perhaps his story does not contain the satisfying explanation people search for. Perhaps there was no hidden philosophy, no grand plan, no single psychological key capable of making 17 murders understandable. There was a man consumed by resentment, capable of violence, who crossed a boundary once and discovered that he could cross it again and again and again. For 6 months, while the rest of northern Italy went to work, traveled home, visited casinos, drove along the coast and boarded evening trains, Donato Bilancia moved among them, not hiding in a forest, not wearing a mask, not living outside society, sitting in bars, driving expensive cars, drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes, looking, to most people who passed him, like just another middle-aged man, until the wrong person crossed his path. Italy eventually gave him a name that placed him alongside the country's darkest criminals, the Monster of Liguria. But unlike the Monster of Florence, this monster had a face. Police found him. The courts convicted him. History knows exactly who he was. And somehow, that certainty does not make the story any less frightening. With Donato Bilancia finally behind bars, many believed one of Italy's darkest chapters had come to an end. But while one killer had been caught, Another investigation was quietly uncovering a truth almost impossible to believe, because this time the people responsible were the very ones sworn to enforce the law. Somewhere in northern Italy, a police radio suddenly crackled to life. Unit 7, respond immediately. Officer down. Officer down. Moments later, the quiet night exploded into chaos. Police sirens screamed through empty streets. Blue lights reflected across rain-soaked pavement. A white Fiat Uno raced through the darkness before disappearing around a corner. By the time officers reached the scene, it was already over. A policeman lay dead. The killers had vanished again. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, Italy believed it was hunting one of the country's most sophisticated criminal gangs. They robbed banks with military precision. They murdered police officers without hesitation. They executed innocent civilians who simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Every attack was perfectly timed. Every escape seemed impossible. Every investigation ended with more questions than answers. Who were they? How did they always know where police would be? Why did they never make mistakes? For almost 7 years, Italy searched for dangerous professional criminals. Instead, they were searching for men who had sworn an oath to protect the public. Tonight, this is the story of the Uno Bianca Gang, one of the darkest chapters in modern Italian history. Chapter 1. The perfect getaway car. Long before investigators discovered the identity of the killers, the public already knew the symbol of their crimes. It wasn't a face, it wasn't a nickname, it wasn't even a weapon. It was a car, a simple white Fiat Uno, small enough to disappear into city traffic, common enough that thousands drove through northern Italy every single day. Forgettable, ordinary, invisible. Witness after witness repeated the same description. A white Fiat Uno. Unfortunately, that description was almost useless. Finding one white Fiat Uno among thousands was like trying to find a single grain of sand on a beach. At first, police believed the vehicle belonged to ordinary criminals. Professional robbers often chose common cars because they attracted little attention. There was nothing unusual about that. What was unusual was the discipline. Every robbery lasted only a few minutes. Every movement appeared rehearsed. Every escape route had already been planned. The attackers never seemed surprised. They never hesitated. They rarely spoke. Even under extreme pressure, they remained calm. Investigators quietly began asking themselves a troubling question. Whoever these men were, had they received military training or perhaps police training? Nobody dared to seriously consider that possibility. Not yet. Northern Italy in the late 1980s was changing rapidly. Cities like Bologna had become symbols of prosperity. Factories expanded. Universities attracted thousands of students. The streets bustled with life from morning until late at night. People felt safe. Police patrols were a familiar sight. Families walked home after dinner without fear. It wasn't perfect, but compared to many other parts of Europe, everyday life felt secure. Then, everything slowly began to change. The first attacks were treated as isolated crimes. An armed robbery here, a shooting there, violence existed In every country, nothing suggested these incidents were connected. But investigators slowly noticed patterns. The same level of planning, the same confidence, the same ruthless willingness to shoot anyone standing in the way. Security guards, police officers, ordinary witnesses. It didn't matter. If someone threatened the gang's escape, they died. Within only a few years, newspapers throughout Italy had begun using the same name, Uno Bianca, the White Uno. The name spread across television broadcasts, newspapers, and evening conversations around family dinner tables. Nobody knew exactly who they were, but everyone recognized the name. Chapter 2. A city begins to live in fear. Bologna was never supposed to become the center of one of Italy's greatest manhunts. It was known for its ancient university, beautiful architecture, and lively streets. Tourists admired the endless porticos stretching across the city. Students filled cafes discussing politics, history, and philosophy. Life moved at a comfortable pace until the shootings became impossible to ignore. Every new attack felt bolder than the last. Banks were robbed in broad daylight. Patrol officers suddenly came under fire. Supermarkets became crime scenes. The violence appeared random. Nobody could predict where the gang would strike next. Police increased patrols. Roadblocks appeared across major highways. Detectives worked around the clock reviewing witness statements. Thousands of hours of surveillance footage were examined. Nothing. The gang always seemed to disappear minutes before officers closed in. It almost felt impossible, almost as if they somehow knew how police investigations worked before anyone else. That single thought refused to disappear. Experienced detectives mentioned it quietly among themselves, not during press conferences, not in official reports, only behind closed doors. Because accusing someone inside the police without evidence was unthinkable. Instead, investigators continued searching among professional criminals, former soldiers, members of organized crime, violent repeat offenders. The real killers watched every step and quietly smiled because every wrong arrest bought them more time. The gang's confidence grew with every successful escape. Each robbery became more ambitious. Each shooting became more ruthless. The public slowly realized something deeply unsettling. These weren't desperate men stealing to survive. They enjoyed control. They enjoyed power. And above all, they enjoyed proving that nobody could stop them. Fear spread far beyond Bologna. Bank employees nervously watched every customer entering the building. Security guards checked exits several times each shift. Police officers approached routine traffic stops with a caution they had never experienced before. Nobody wanted to be the next name appearing in tomorrow's newspaper. Still, the attacks continued, without warning, without mercy, always ending the same way, a white Fiat Uno disappearing into traffic. Chapter 3. A city held hostage. As 1990 approached, the Uno Bianca Gang had already committed dozens of violent crimes, yet investigators still struggled to understand exactly who they were dealing with. What made the case so frustrating wasn't simply the brutality of the attacks, it was their consistency. Every robbery appeared almost identical in execution. The gunmen arrived with confidence, moved with military-like precision, and disappeared before officers had time to organize an effective response. It was becoming increasingly difficult to believe they were simply experienced robbers. Inside police headquarters, investigators covered entire walls with photographs, maps, and timelines. Every robbery, every murder, and every witness statement was carefully pinned together in the hope that one overlooked detail might finally reveal the identity of the gang. Detectives worked late into the night comparing ballistic reports, surveillance photographs, and vehicle registrations. Thousands of white Fiat Unos were investigated across northern Italy, but every promising lead ended in disappointment. The killers always remained just beyond reach. While detectives searched for answers, ordinary Italians slowly changed their daily routines. Bank employees arrived at work with a growing sense of anxiety, knowing that almost every robbery committed by the gang had begun on what appeared to be an ordinary morning. Security guards started wearing heavier body armor, while police officers quietly reminded one another never to underestimate even the smallest routine patrol. Fear had become part of everyday life. The media quickly realized that the mysterious gang captivated the entire country. Evening news broadcasts opened with updates from the investigation, while newspapers competed to publish exclusive information about the latest attacks. Every crime scene seemed to generate another wave of speculation. Were the gang connected to the mafia? Were they former soldiers? Were they political extremists? Every theory seemed plausible, yet none could explain how they repeatedly outsmarted hundreds of investigators. As public pressure mounted, politicians demanded faster results. Additional resources were poured into the investigation, and specialized units joined the search. Helicopters monitored highways after major robberies, roadblocks appeared throughout Emilia-Romagna, and undercover officers infiltrated criminal organizations, hoping someone might recognize the pattern. Yet despite the enormous operation, the Uno Bianca Gang continued striking almost whenever they pleased. The confidence of the gang only seemed to grow. They no longer behaved like men trying to avoid attention. Instead, they appeared determined to demonstrate that nobody, not even the police, could stop them. Chapter 4. The killers become bolder. During the early years of the crime spree, money had appeared to be the primary motivation. Banks, supermarkets, and armored vehicles carried obvious financial rewards, and investigators naturally assumed robbery remained the gang's ultimate objective. Over time, however, something changed. Violence was no longer simply a means of escape. It became part of the operation itself. Victims who posed little threat were shot without hesitation. Security guards surrendering their weapons were executed. Police officers responding to emergency calls found themselves facing criminals who displayed almost no emotion while pulling the trigger. Witnesses later described the attackers as calm, focused, and frighteningly disciplined. There was no shouting, no panic, and no unnecessary movement. Every action appeared rehearsed long before the attack began. One robbery in particular deeply shocked investigators. After intercepting an armored transport, the gang opened fire with extraordinary precision, killing those who attempted to resist before disappearing within minutes. The attack demonstrated not only excellent planning, but also remarkable familiarity with police response procedures. detectives began asking how ordinary criminals could predict patrol movements with such incredible accuracy. Some investigators privately entertained a theory that would have sounded absurd only months earlier. Perhaps the gang contained someone with direct law enforcement experience. Perhaps one or more members had previously worked alongside the very officers now chasing them. The idea remained largely unspoken. Accusing police officers without evidence would have damaged public confidence in every institution responsible for protecting the country. Instead, investigators continued searching among professional criminals. Meanwhile, the gang continued learning. Every failed investigation taught them something new. Every police press conference revealed another piece of information about investigative tactics. Every escaped robbery reinforced the belief that they remained untouchable. As the months passed, attacks spread beyond Bologna into neighboring regions. Communities that had once followed the story from a distance suddenly found themselves at the center of the investigation. Local police departments received additional training, while emergency response plans were rewritten to account for the gang's unusual level of violence. Despite these preparations, success remained painfully limited. Each time investigators believed they had finally identified a suspect, evidence quickly collapsed. Witnesses contradicted one another. Fingerprints failed to match. Ballistic examinations led nowhere. The white Fiat Uno became almost mythical, appearing briefly before disappearing once again into ordinary traffic. For many Italians, it felt as though the gang simply could not be caught. One particularly devastating attack further transformed public opinion. Police officers responding to what initially appeared to be a routine situation suddenly found themselves under heavy gunfire. The speed and accuracy of the ambush suggested careful preparation rather than spontaneous violence. Within moments, another officer had lost his life. Television broadcasts carried images of mourning families and solemn funerals attended by hundreds of fellow officers. Italian flags covered the coffins as colleagues stood silently beside them. Across the country, people began asking difficult questions. How could a small group of criminals repeatedly kill trained police officers while remaining completely anonymous? The emotional impact reached far beyond law enforcement. Parents worried about children working in banks. Security companies struggled to recruit new employees. Officers kissed their families goodbye before each shift with an uncomfortable awareness that routine patrols no longer felt routine. Behind closed doors, frustration inside the investigation reached extraordinary levels. Senior detectives had dedicated years to the case without producing meaningful breakthroughs. Younger investigators entered the task force only to discover shelves already filled with thousands of reports that had produced almost nothing. Every possible criminal network had been examined. Every known armed robber questioned. Every likely suspect investigated. Still, the murders continued. Unknown to investigators, the answer had been hiding in plain sight from the very beginning. The men responsible understood police procedure because they lived it every day. They knew how crime scenes were processed, how evidence was collected, and how officers coordinated searches after major incidents. They understood radio communication, patrol schedules, and investigative priorities because they had personally used those systems for years. That knowledge gave them an advantage almost no criminal organization had ever possessed. It also ensured that when detectives searched for experienced robbers, they never thought to search their own ranks. By the early 1990s, northern Italy had become trapped in a cycle of fear and uncertainty. Every new robbery seemed larger than the last. Every funeral attracted more mourners, and every failed investigation eroded public confidence just a little further. Yet despite the growing violence, the Uno Bianca Gang remained remarkably disciplined. They rarely left useful evidence behind. They carefully selected their targets, and above all, they maintained absolute trust within their own group. That trust would eventually become their greatest strength. It would also become the one mistake that ultimately brought everything crashing down. Chapter 5. The investigation takes a new direction. By 1992, the Uno Bianca investigation had become one of the largest criminal inquiries in modern Italian history. Hundreds of officers from different police departments had worked the case, and thousands of witness statements had been collected. Ballistics experts compared weapons used in dozens of attacks, while detectives attempted to establish a clear pattern linking robberies, murders, and assaults that had occurred across northern Italy. Although many attacks differed in their immediate objective, investigators noticed several consistent characteristics. The gang preferred speed over prolonged confrontations. They carefully selected escape routes before each operation, and they almost always struck in areas where they understood the surrounding roads exceptionally well. Every successful robbery strengthened the belief that the group had planned each crime long before arriving at the scene. Public confidence, however, was beginning to fade. Every major investigation seemed to produce the same disappointing outcome. New suspects would briefly appear in newspaper headlines before quietly being ruled out. Anonymous tip lines received thousands of calls, but very few provided information that could be verified. As the years passed, many Italians began wondering whether the gang would ever be identified. The task force itself also faced an enormous challenge. Investigators were not searching for one isolated murder or one bank robbery. They were trying to solve dozens of violent crimes committed over several years, often across different provinces and involving multiple police agencies. Coordinating information on such a scale was difficult, especially during a period when modern digital databases were still in their infancy. Detectives relied heavily on paper files, physical evidence, and countless hours of interviews. Despite the frustration, investigators refused to abandon the case. Every robbery was reconstructed in extraordinary detail. Witnesses were re-interviewed years after the attacks. Officers returned to old crime scenes, hoping that something insignificant overlooked during the original investigation might suddenly become important. Slowly, a clearer picture of the gang began to emerge. The attackers displayed remarkable discipline, but they were not unpredictable. Their operations followed routines. They preferred familiar areas. They rarely acted impulsively. Most importantly, they appeared to possess knowledge that ordinary criminals simply should not have had. That observation became increasingly difficult to ignore. Chapter 6. Small mistakes. For years, the Uno Bianca Gang had appeared almost untouchable. They had survived roadblocks, nationwide investigations, and intense media attention. Yet history has shown that Even the most organized criminal groups rarely collapse because of one dramatic mistake. More often, they begin to unravel through a series of small errors that, when viewed together, reveal a much larger truth. By the early 1990s, investigators were re-examining older evidence with fresh eyes. Advances in forensic techniques allowed some material to be reviewed again, while improved communication between police departments made it easier to compare incidents that had once been investigated separately. Information that had previously remained isolated was now beginning to form meaningful connections. At the same time, the gang itself was becoming increasingly active. Their long period of success may have encouraged a dangerous sense of confidence. Every successful escape reinforced the belief that they could continue operating without consequence. That confidence would eventually work against them. Several attacks displayed similarities that investigators could no longer dismiss as coincidence. Certain weapons appeared repeatedly. The timing of operations followed familiar patterns. Vehicles connected to different crimes were traced through overlapping geographic areas. Although none of these discoveries identified the offenders directly, together they narrowed the investigation considerably. Meanwhile, officers quietly reconsidered an idea that had once seemed almost impossible. What if the gang's understanding of police tactics came not from observation, but from experience? The theory remained highly sensitive. Accusing members of law enforcement without compelling evidence risked damaging public trust in institutions already under enormous pressure. Investigators therefore proceeded cautiously, discussing the possibility only within a small group directly involved in the inquiry. As the investigation entered its final phase, detectives focused less on traditional criminal organizations and more on individuals who possessed specialized knowledge of policing, firearms, and coordinated operations. It was a subtle but significant shift in direction. Unknown to the public, the distance between investigators and the truth was beginning to shrink. The men responsible had spent years believing they could outthink every detective assigned to the case. They had exploited their knowledge of police procedures, communication systems, and investigative methods with extraordinary success. Yet the very experience that had protected them also created recognizable patterns. Those patterns, almost invisible when viewed individually, became increasingly obvious when examined together. For the first time since the crime spree had begun, investigators felt they were no longer chasing shadows. They were closing in on real people. They simply didn't know their names yet. Chapter 7. The investigation breaks open. By late 1994, the investigation had entered its 8th year. Hundreds of officers had worked the case, countless suspects had been questioned, and northern Italy had lived under the shadow of the Uno Bianca Gang for so long that many wondered if the mystery would ever be solved. The breakthrough did not come from a spectacular undercover operation or a dramatic confession. Instead, it emerged through patient investigative work, careful surveillance, and the determination of detectives who refused to abandon the case. Investigators gradually began focusing on a small group of individuals whose movements, experience, and circumstances appeared increasingly difficult to ignore. Among them were brothers Roberto Savi and Fabio Savi, both serving police officers. Their professional background immediately explained many of the questions that had haunted investigators for years. They understood police patrol routes because they had worked them. They knew how investigations developed because they had participated in them. They understood radio procedures, response times, and crime scene management because those were skills they used every day. For years, they had hidden in plain sight. As surveillance intensified, investigators quietly gathered evidence connecting members of the group to several of the attacks. Each new discovery strengthened the case. The possibility that police officers themselves could be responsible for years of robberies and murders was almost unimaginable. Detectives understood that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. Every detail had to be verified before arrests could be made. Finally, after years of investigation, authorities believed they had enough. On November 21st, 1994, officers moved in. The arrests marked one of the most shocking moments in modern Italian criminal history. The country had spent years searching for ruthless professional criminals. Instead, investigators had uncovered colleagues. The news spread across Italy within hours. Television broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Newspapers rushed special editions to print. For millions of Italians, disbelief quickly turned into anger. The men accused of terrorizing northern Italy had sworn to uphold the law. Instead, prosecutors alleged they had spent years violating it in the most violent ways imaginable. Chapter 8. Confessions. Following the arrests, the investigation accelerated dramatically. As evidence mounted, members of the gang began providing information about crimes committed over nearly 8 years. Investigators carefully compared every statement against forensic evidence, witness testimony, and ballistic reports that had accumulated since 1987. The emerging picture was staggering. The Uno Bianca Gang was ultimately linked to 103 criminal attacks committed between 1987 and 1994. Those attacks included bank robberies, supermarket robberies, assaults on armored vehicles, murders and attempted murders across northern Italy. In total, 24 people lost their lives, while well over 100 others were injured. Entire communities had been affected. Families had lost loved ones. Police officers had buried colleagues. Survivors carried physical and emotional scars that would last for decades. The investigation revealed that the gang consisted primarily of the Savi brothers, Fabio, Roberto, and Alberto Savi, along with associates Pietro Gugliotta, Marino Occhipinti, and Luciano Baglioni. What shocked investigators almost as much as the crimes themselves was the ordinary appearance of the offenders. There had been no criminal empire, no elaborate underground organization, no international conspiracy. Instead, much of the violence had been carried out by men living seemingly ordinary lives while secretly committing some of Italy's most notorious crimes. Their double lives stunned the country. By day, several members appeared to be respected professionals. By night, they transformed into armed robbers and killers. It was a contrast that made the case particularly disturbing. The danger had not come from outsiders. It had come from individuals entrusted with public safety. Chapter 9. Justice. The trials that followed attracted enormous public attention. Courtrooms filled with journalists, victims' families, and members of the public hoping to understand how such a prolonged crime spree had been possible. Over months of proceedings, prosecutors presented extensive forensic evidence, ballistic examinations, witness testimony, and confessions that linked the defendants to the crimes. The scale of the investigation was unprecedented. Years of evidence collected by countless detectives finally came together inside the courtroom. The verdicts reflected the extraordinary seriousness of the offenses. Several members of the gang received multiple life sentences. For many families, however, no verdict could erase years of grief. Justice had arrived. Closure was more complicated. Parents still mourned children. Children still grew up without fathers. Police departments continued remembering colleagues who never returned home after routine shifts. Even after the trials concluded, the Uno Bianca case remained a defining chapter in Italian criminal history. Law enforcement agencies carefully reviewed investigative procedures, communication systems, and internal oversight. The realization that serving officers had exploited their knowledge to evade capture for years prompted important discussions about accountability, supervision, and institutional trust. The case also changed how investigators approached organized, violent crime. Information sharing between police departments improved, forensic coordination became stronger, and major investigations increasingly relied upon centralized databases rather than isolated local inquiries. The lessons learned from Uno Bianca extended far beyond the courtroom. Epilogue: a white Fiat Uno. Today, the white Fiat Uno is remembered for many reasons. For most people, it remains an ordinary compact car that once filled Italian roads. For others, it represents one of the darkest criminal investigations the country has ever faced. The Uno Bianca Gang demonstrated that appearances can be dangerously misleading. For nearly 8 years, investigators searched among career criminals, organized crime networks, and violent offenders. The truth proved far more unsettling. The men responsible had hidden behind uniforms, routines, and ordinary lives. Their greatest weapon was not simply firearms or planning. It was trust. The trust placed in them by colleagues, the trust placed in them by the public, and the assumption that those sworn to enforce the law could never become the very people they were hunting. The case remains one of the most infamous crime sprees in Italian history, not only because of the number of victims, but because it challenged fundamental assumptions about authority, responsibility, and justice. For investigators who spent years pursuing the gang, the arrests brought relief, but also reflection. The answers had finally arrived. They were simply far closer than anyone had imagined. Thank you for listening to this documentary. If you enjoy long-form true crime documentaries exploring real criminal cases from around the world, consider subscribing to The Horror Library. Until next time, stay curious, and thank you for watching.